Heavy gunfire and explosions rocked Niger's capital, Niamey.
The country's military ruler has accused France, Benin and Ivory Coast of sponsoring the attack.
Just after midnight on January 29, 2026, gunfire and explosions tore through Niamey's International Airport, and by morning Niger's military leader wasn't blaming jihadists, he was blaming France, Benin and Ivory Coast by name.
Aux sponsors de ces mercenaires, notamment Emmanuel Macron, Patrice Talon, Alassane Ouattara, nous les avons suffisamment écoutés aboyer qu'ils s'apprêtent, eux aussi, à leur tour, à nous écouter rugir.
While thanking Russian troops for defending the base.
C'est l'occasion pour nous de venir prendre contact avec l'ensemble des forces de défense et de sécurité, ainsi que nos partenaires russes, pour leur prompte réaction. Réaction qui a permis, dans les 20 minutes qui suivent, de mettre l'ennemi totalement en déroute.
That tells you everything about what's actually happening in the Sahel right now, which isn't just a terrorism crisis anymore. It's a complete geopolitical realignment where every attack becomes ammunition for whoever's trying to rewrite the regional power structure, and the truth becomes whatever narrative fits the political moment. Here's what actually happened, stripped of the politics for a second. Around midnight local time, armed assailants attacked Diori Hamani International Airport in Niamey, Niger's capital. The facility isn't just a civilian airport, it houses Base 101 of the Nigerien Air Force, recently renovated to host new Turkish-made drones, and it's the headquarters of the combined military forces of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, 3 countries now aligned under military juntas that have expelled Western forces and turned to Russia for support. The fighting lasted about an hour, maybe 2 hours depending on which residents you ask. Videos captured by locals showed tracers lighting up the sky, anti-aircraft fire, explosions visible from kilometers away. By morning, calm had returned, but the damage was visible. Several aircraft on the tarmac, including planes from Asky Airlines and Air Côte d'Ivoire, were damaged or destroyed. Satellite images analyzed later showed scorched earth near the runway. Niger's defense ministry reported that 4 soldiers were injured, 20 attackers were killed, and 11 were arrested. State media claimed one of the dead attackers was a French national, showing footage of bloodied bodies on the ground, though they provided no verification. No militant group officially claimed responsibility, which is unusual because groups like Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, known as Jainim, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and Islamic State affiliates operating in the Sahel typically claim such high-profile attacks within hours or days to maximize propaganda value. The fact that nobody claimed it immediately raises questions, but not the questions you'd think. Analysts who track these groups said the pattern, the tactics, the target selection, all of it fits Jainim modus operandi perfectly. They'd been building presence in areas near Niamey for months, and there had been warnings of an imminent attack in the days leading up to January 29th. So the silence from jihadist groups could mean the operation failed badly enough that claiming it would hurt their credibility, or it could mean something else entirely was happening. What makes this attack strategically significant beyond the immediate violence is location and timing. The airport sits about 10 kilometers from the presidential palace, and it's not just a transportation hub, it's a symbol of Niger's sovereignty and military capacity. But there's another detail that barely made headlines, but matters a lot. Stored inside warehouses at the airport are 1,000 tons of concentrated uranium oxide, commonly called yellowcake, extracted from the Arlet mine by the French company Orano. This uranium is the subject of a bitter dispute between Orano and Niger's military junta after the junta nationalized the Sommer mine in 2024 and announced plans to sell Niger's uranium on the international market. The cargo was supposed to be purchased by a Russian company and transported overland to the port of Niamey in Togo, a route that crosses areas controlled by jihadist groups. French diplomatic pressure forced Niger to postpone the transfer, leaving the uranium stranded inside the airport terminal. So when armed groups attacked the airport, they weren't just hitting a military base, they were hitting the facility where one of Niger's most valuable strategic assets is sitting vulnerable. Now let's talk about what General Abdurrahman Tiani said, because this is where the story stops being about terrorism and starts being about politics. Tiani, who seized power in a July 2023 coup that overthrew elected President Mohamed Bazoum, visited the airport after the attack and gave a televised address on Niger state television. He didn't talk about jihadist threats or regional insecurity or the need for better counter-terrorism coordination. He blamed France, Benin, and Ivory Coast, naming their presidents directly. We remind the sponsors of these mercenaries, notably Emmanuel Macron, Patrice Talon, and Alassane Ouattara. We have heard them bark quite enough now. They should get ready to listen to us roar. He offered no evidence, no intelligence reports, no intercepted communications, nothing. Just accusations delivered as facts broadcast to a population that's already deeply suspicious of France after decades of colonial and post-colonial intervention. Tiani also praised Russian troops stationed at the base for defending their sector with professionalism, which confirms what analysts have suspected for months. Russia has a significant military presence at Niamey's airport, likely operating drones, providing intelligence support, and training Nigerian forces. Since the 2023 coup, Niger, along with Mali and Burkina Faso, has systematically expelled Western forces, particularly French troops, and replaced them with Russian military advisors, mercenaries from groups like Wagner, and strategic partnerships with Moscow that include arms deals, training programs, and intelligence sharing. The US military, which had been operating drones from Base 101 for counter-terrorism missions until July 2024, was forced to withdraw after the junta demanded their departure. So when Tiani thanks Russian troops while accusing France of sponsoring the attack, he's not just deflecting blame, he's signaling to his domestic audience and regional allies that Niger's security now depends on Russia, not the West. The accusations against Benin and Ivory Coast are equally political and equally unsubstantiated. Tiani has been accusing these two countries, along with France, of destabilizing Niger since the coup. In multiple speeches over the past year, he's claimed that France is using Benin as a base to launch covert operations against Niger, that Benin is hosting French troops with the explicit goal of undermining the Nigerian junta, and that Ivory Coast is complicit in a broader Western plot to restore the ousted civilian government. Benin and Ivory Coast both condemned the 2023 coup and supported ECOWAS sanctions against Niger, which included border closures and trade restrictions that devastated Niger's economy. Benin's port of Cotonou is a critical transit point for goods reaching landlocked Niger, and when that access was cut off, it strangled supply lines and drove up prices. Tiani views Benin's President Patrice Talon and Ivory Coast's President Alassane Ouattara as French proxies leaders who prioritize Western interests over African solidarity. That's the narrative he's been building domestically, and the airport attack gave him a perfect opportunity to reinforce it. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Tiani's accusations might be politically motivated and evidence-free, but the grievances they're built on aren't entirely invented. France has a long, deeply problematic history in the Sahel, maintaining military bases, economic control over uranium and other resources, and political influence over governments that often served French interests more than their own populations. The CFA franc, a currency used in 14 African countries, including Niger, until the junta started exploring alternatives, is still partially controlled by the French treasury, which means France has direct influence over monetary policy in countries that are supposedly independent. French companies like Orano and Total have extracted billions of dollars worth resources from Niger while leaving the country as one of the poorest in the world, despite sitting on vast uranium deposits and significant oil reserves. So when Tiani rails against French interference, he's tapping into legitimate anger that predates his coup and resonates with millions of Nigerians who see France as a neo-colonial power that never really left. The problem is that Tiani isn't offering a better alternative, he's just replacing one form of dependence with another. Russian military support comes with strings attached, just like French support did. Wagner mercenaries and Russian advisors aren't in Niger out of solidarity with African liberation. They're there because Russia wants access to uranium, strategic positioning in West Africa, and a foothold in a region where Western influence is collapsing. The difference is that Russia doesn't lecture Niger about democracy or human rights, which makes the relationship more comfortable politically, even if it's equally transactional economically. And critically, Russia doesn't have the same baggage as France. There's no history of Russian colonialism in West Africa, no bitter memories of exploitation and humiliation, which means Moscow can position itself as a partner against Western imperialism without triggering the same visceral reactions that French involvement does. What's getting lost in all the geopolitical posturing is the actual security crisis that's killing people daily. The Sahel is experiencing some of the worst jihadist violence in the world. Niamey and Islamic State affiliates control vast swaths of territory in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, conducting attacks that kill soldiers, civilians, and humanitarian workers with terrifying regularity. Just days before the airport attack, Niamey claimed responsibility for destroying an army vehicle with an improvised explosive device just kilometers east of Niamey. On May 25, 2025, Islamic State fighters killed at least 58 Nigerian soldiers at the Eknoan camp near the Mali border. The day before that, Al-Qaeda fighters killed around 40 soldiers in Falmey. These aren't isolated incidents, this is a sustained insurgency that's getting worse, not better. And the military juntas that promise to restore security have failed spectacularly. The reason they're failing is that militarizing the response without addressing the underlying drivers of extremism doesn't work. Jihadist groups in the Sahel recruit effectively because they offer protection, justice systems, and economic opportunities in regions where the state has been absent or predatory for decades. When governments are corrupt, when soldiers extort civilians at checkpoints, when there's no functioning justice system and no economic opportunity, people turn to whoever can provide those things, even if it's a jihadist group with a brutal interpretation of Sharia law. The military juntas in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have doubled down on military solutions, expanding their armies, buying weapons from Russia, and launching offensives that rack up body counts but don't reclaim territory permanently. Meanwhile, they've dissolved political parties, arrested opposition figures, and delayed promised transitions to civilian rule, which means the governance problems that fueled extremism in the first place are getting worse, not better. The airport attack exposes all of this. It shows that even the capital isn't safe, that jihadist groups have the capacity to hit strategic targets within kilometers of the presidential palace, and that Niger's military, despite Russian support and new equipment, can't prevent these attacks. But instead of acknowledging that reality and adjusting strategy, Tiani blamed foreign enemies, which is easier politically than admitting the junta's approach isn't working. It's classic authoritarian playbook. When things go wrong, blame external conspiracies, rally nationalist sentiment, and use the crisis to consolidate power. The danger is that this narrative becomes self-fulfilling. If Nigerians genuinely believe France, Benin, and Ivory Coast are sponsoring terrorism against them, it justifies further isolation, deeper dependence on Russia, and escalating tensions with neighbors, all of which makes the region less stable and more vulnerable to the jihadist groups that are actually killing people. France, Benin, and Ivory Coast have not responded to Tiani's accusations as of now, which is probably the smartest move diplomatically, because engaging with evidence-free claims just legitimizes them. But the silence also creates space for the accusations to take root domestically in Niger, where anti-French sentiment is already high and where many people want to believe that their problems are caused by external enemies rather than internal failures. The uranium dispute, the closed borders with Benin, the deteriorating relations with ECOWAS, all of it feeds into a narrative where Niger is under siege from hostile neighbors and former colonial powers, which justifies authoritarian measures and delays any meaningful political reform. What happens next depends on whether Niamey or another jihadist group eventually claims the attack, and whether any evidence emerges linking the attackers to external sponsors, which seems unlikely given that these groups operate independently and don't need foreign backing to conduct operations. But the truth might not matter as much as the narrative that's already been set. Tiani has framed the attack as foreign aggression, thanked Russia for repelling it, and vowed retaliation against the countries he's accused. That's the story most Nigerians will remember, not the details about who actually pulled the triggers or why. And that's the real danger here, not just the violence itself, but how easily violence gets weaponized for political narratives that have nothing to do with stopping the next attack. The part that should worry everyone watching this region is that the Sahel is becoming a laboratory for what happens when countries reject Western influence, align with Russia, and militarize governance without addressing the structural problems that created instability in the first place. It's not working. Jihadist violence is increasing, not decreasing. Economies are collapsing under sanctions and isolation. Democratic institutions are being dismantled, and the populations that were promised security and sovereignty are getting neither, just more violence, more repression, and more rhetoric about external enemies. That's not a path towards stability, that's a path towards state failure. And when states fail in regions with porous borders, weak institutions, and armed groups that operate transnationally, the consequences spread far beyond the countries where the collapse starts.